Imagine a road. Not just any road, but the great Appian Way, the artery of the Roman Republic, the first and most famous of all Roman roads. Now, imagine it transformed into a monument of pure, unadulterated terror. For over 120 miles, from the gates of Rome to the city of Capua, the road is lined with them. 6,000 of them. 6,000 wooden crosses, each one bearing the slow-dying, agonized body of a man. For weeks, the air is filled with their screams, then their groans, and then finally, a horrifying silence, broken only by the sound of crows. Travelers are forced to walk this corridor of death, this grotesque gallery of Roman fury, a message written in human suffering on a continental scale. This was not the act of a madman. It was an act of policy. This was the calculated, industrial-scale vengeance of the most powerful republic the world had ever known. And all of it, every cross, every scream, every nail, was because of one man. His name was Spartacus. History remembers him as a hero, a freedom fighter, a symbol of the oppressed rising against their masters. Hollywood has carved his legend in stone, but the truth is far darker, far more brutal, and far more tragic than any film could portray. This is not the story of a hero who won. This is the story of a man who dared to dream of freedom in a world built on slavery, and in doing so, unleashed a nightmare that would consume him and everyone who followed him. This is the story of the greatest slave revolt in Roman history, a 2-year-long firestorm that brought the seemingly invincible republic to its knees. But more than that, this is the story of what happens when the Roman war machine, humiliated and enraged, finally decides to stop playing games. It is the story of the cold, ambitious billionaire who was sent to crush the rebellion, and the horrifying spectacle he created to ensure that no slave would ever dare to dream of freedom again. This is a story that ends not with a victory, but with a warning written across the Italian landscape with 6,000 screaming bodies. This is the story of what Rome does to those who break their chains. This is the story of being crucified. Before the legend, there was the man, and before the man, there was the beast. The story of Spartacus does not begin with the roar of a rebellious army, but in the chilling, unnatural silence of a cage. He was, before anything else, a commodity, human livestock, purchased and appraised for his physical attributes, his strength, his speed, his capacity to inflict and endure violence. The name that would one day make senators tremble was, at this point, just a label on a piece of merchandise, a brand seared into the flesh of a man who had been stripped of everything but the sinew in his arms and the fire in his soul. Who was he before Rome unmade him? The historical records are a frustrating fog, a collection of fragmented and often contradictory accounts written by his enemies. But the most persistent tradition, the one that rings with the iron truth of his character, is that he was a Thracian. This is not a trivial detail. To a Roman, the word Thracian was a form of shorthand. It conjured images of the wild, mountainous lands to the north of Greece, a place that bred men as hard and unforgiving as the landscape itself. The Thracians were a people of fierce, almost suicidal courage, warriors who were said to enter battle with a wild, joyous frenzy, who prized freedom above all else. Some accounts claim that Spartacus was not just a common tribesman, but a man of noble birth. Others, more tantalizingly, suggest that he had once served as an auxiliary in the Roman legions themselves, a free man who had fought for the eagle before deserting or being captured. If true, the irony is staggering. The man who would become Rome's greatest internal enemy may well have learned the art of war from Roman centurions, his genius for tactics forged in the very system he was destined to tear apart. Whatever his past, his present, in the year 73 BC, was a nightmare. He was a slave, captured in some forgotten war or raid. He had been judged too strong, too defiant, too dangerous for the mundane misery of the mines or the fields. For men like him, men with fire in their eyes and death in their hands, the Roman system had a special destination. He was sold to a man named Lentulus Batiatus, a Lannister, and sent to the one place in the Republic that was a gateway to both immortal fame and almost certain death, a gladiatorial school, a ludus, in the opulent, decadent, and sun-drenched city of Capua. To understand the rebellion, you must first understand the pressure cooker of despair that was a Roman ludus. From the outside, the gladiatorial games were the Republic's greatest spectacle, a form of mass entertainment that dwarfed all others. But behind the roar of the crowd and the gleaming armor was a brutal, industrial-scale meat grinder, a factory of death where the raw material was human life. The men who fought in these arenas were the bottom of the Roman social ladder. They were prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and slaves like Spartacus, men who were legally considered not as people, but as things. They were the walking dead, their lives measured only in the time between their purchase and their inevitable, violent end. The ludus of Batiatus in Capua was one of the most famous in Italy, a prestigious supplier of flesh for the arenas, and life inside its walls was a carefully calibrated hell, a system designed to strip a man of his identity and rebuild him as a killing machine. A new recruit was no longer a Thracian, a Gaul, or a German. He was a gladiator. His past was erased. His future was the sand of the arena. Every moment of his day was controlled. He was housed in a cramped, windowless cell, a stone box that stank of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies. His diet was a monotonous, high-carbohydrate slop of barley and beans, designed not for health, but to build a layer of fat over his muscles, a layer that would make for more spectacular, bloody, but non-fatal flesh wounds in the arena. The training was relentless and savage. From dawn until dusk, the men were driven by the Lannisters' trainers, men who used the whip and the brand as their primary tools of instruction. They were taught the intricate dance of death, forced to master the specialized techniques of the various gladiatorial classes. A man might be trained as a Murmillo, the heavily armored swordsman with his fish-crested helmet, or a retiarius, the lightly armored net and trident fighter, or a Threx, a cruel irony for Spartacus, forcing him to fight in the stylized armor of his own people for the entertainment of his conquerors. Every day was a brutal rehearsal for their own death. They fought with blunted wooden weapons, but the training was so intense that injuries were constant and weakness was not tolerated. A man who could not keep up, a man who broke, was a bad investment, and Batiatus was a businessman who knew how to cut his losses. The psychological torment was perhaps even worse than the physical. These were men from dozens of different tribes and nations, speaking a babel of different languages. They were Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Samnites warriors, who in their former lives would have been bitter enemies. Now, they were crammed together, their warrior pride replaced by the shared humiliation of the slave's collar. Batiatus and his guards likely encouraged this internal division, pitting the men against each other to prevent them from ever finding common cause. They were rivals, competing for better rations, for minor privileges, for the slim, almost non-existent chance of one day winning their freedom. But in the ludus of Batiatus, a critical mass of despair was reached. The school held over 200 gladiators, and a large contingent of them were not criminals, but recently captured Gauls and Thracians, men for whom the memory of freedom was still a fresh and burning wound. And among them, two figures began to emerge as leaders: Spartacus, the Thracian, with his brilliant, tactical mind and his unquenchable fire, and Crassus, a Gallic warrior, a man of immense physical strength and raw, untempered fury. They were the opposite poles of the rebellion, the brain and the brawn, and together, they began to do what Batiatus had believed was impossible. They began to talk. In whispered conversations in the dark of their cells, in secret glances across the training yard, they began to forge a brotherhood from their shared misery. They were from different lands, but they spoke the common language of oppression. They were all beasts being fattened for the slaughter, and they all shared the same, desperate, primal desire, to die not as sport for a jeering crowd, but as free men. A plan, an act of sheer, suicidal audacity, began to form. They would break out. The spark came from the most mundane of places, the kitchen. The gladiators, being marched through the ludus's kitchens, saw their chance. In a sudden, coordinated explosion of violence, they overwhelmed their guards. They had no swords, no spears. Their first weapons were the tools of the cook: kitchen knives, meat cleavers, and long, metal roasting spits. It was a messy, desperate, and savage fight. But these were not common slaves. They were 200 of the most dangerous and highly trained killers in the world. The guards were cut down in seconds. Around 78 of the gladiators, led by Spartacus and Crassus, managed to fight their way out of the school and into the streets of Capua. They were free, but they were also trapped, a handful of desperate men armed with kitchen utensils in the middle of a hostile Roman city. But fortune, the goddess who favors the bold, smiled upon them. As they fought their way through the city, they stumbled upon a wagon. Not just any wagon, but a cart filled with a freshly sharpened and polished consignment of gladiatorial weapons and armor, being transported to another city for a set of games. It was a miracle. It was an arsenal, delivered to them by the gods of rebellion. Now armed as the killing machines Rome had made them, they easily fought their way out of Capua, but they did not scatter. Spartacus, his tactical mind already taking control, knew that a scattered mob would be hunted down and destroyed. They needed a fortress, a base, and he led them to the perfect one. They marched to the great, slumbering mountain that loomed over the entire region, a place of myth and wild, untamed nature, Mount Vesuvius. They made their camp in its dormant, bowl-shaped crater, a perfect, natural fortress, easily defensible and with a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. The news of the breakout at first caused little more than amusement in Rome. A handful of runaway gladiators? It was a minor annoyance, a job for the local militia, not the legions. The praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber was dispatched from Rome with a hastily assembled force of 3,000 raw recruits. He did not see it as a war, he saw it as a police action. He marched his men to Vesuvius, and, finding only one known path up to the crater, he simply blockaded it. He built a camp at the foot of the path and settled in for a simple siege. The gladiators were trapped. They had no food, no water. In a few days, he reasoned, they would either starve or surrender. It was a logical, conventional, and utterly complacent plan. And it was exactly what Spartacus was counting on. The side of Vesuvius's crater opposite the Roman camp was a sheer, seemingly impassable cliff face, covered in wild grapevines. It was here that Spartacus demonstrated the flash of lateral, unconventional genius that would define his leadership. He ordered his men to harvest the tough, thick vines. Working quickly, they braided them into long, sturdy ropes and makeshift ladders. And that night, under the cover of darkness, Spartacus and his men performed their first military miracle. One by one, they rappelled down the treacherous cliff face, a silent, ghostly descent that was completely unobserved by the confident Romans. They landed at the base of the mountain, circled around Glaber's undefended camp, and just as the sun was rising, they fell upon the sleeping, unsuspecting Roman force from the one direction they had never thought to guard, their rear. The attack was a total surprise. The raw Roman recruits, who had likely never even seen real combat, awoke to a nightmare. The beasts they thought they had caged were now among them, their gladiatorial skills turning the camp into an abattoir. The Roman force was not just defeated, it was annihilated. Glaber and his men were utterly humiliated, their camp overrun, their weapons and armor now the property of the men they had been sent to crush. On the slopes of Vesuvius, as the sun rose over the wreckage of the Roman camp, a new reality was born. This was no longer just a band of desperate fugitives. They were an army. They had taken on the power of Rome, and they had won. Spartacus had proven that the chains could be broken, and that the masters could bleed. The news of this impossible victory would now spread like wildfire through the slave-run estates of Campania, a message of hope and rebellion that would soon swell their small band into a torrent that would threaten to drown the Republic itself. The victory on the slopes of Vesuvius was a spark thrown into a powder keg, the news of what had happened, that a handful of runaway gladiators had not just defied, but had utterly annihilated a Roman army of 3,000 men spread through the slave-run plantations of Campania with the speed of a whispered prayer. For the hundreds of thousands of slaves who toiled in the fields and villas of southern Italy, men and women who lived a life of brutal, dehumanizing, and hopeless servitude, this was not just news. It was a prophecy. It was a miracle. It was the impossible made real. Spartacus had not just defeated a Roman praetor, he had defeated the idea of Roman invincibility, and in doing so, he had lit a fire in the hearts of the oppressed. And they began to come. At first, it was a trickle. Field slaves from the nearby estates, their bodies scarred by the whip, their eyes burning with a lifetime of hatred, would steal away in the night, armed with nothing but a sharpened farming tool and a desperate hope. They were shepherds from the hills, herdsmen, and other runaways. They made their way to Vesuvius, drawn to the banner of the man who had shown them that their masters could bleed. They were not soldiers. They were a raw, disorganized, and desperate mass of humanity. But they were fuel for Spartacus's fire. Spartacus, now the undisputed leader of this burgeoning movement, faced a challenge far greater than defeating a single complacent Roman army. He had to transform this chaotic rabble of untrained, multilingual slaves into a functional fighting force. It was a task that would have been impossible for any conventional military mind. His new recruits had no armor, no weapons, no discipline. They were a volatile mix of Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and a dozen other peoples, each with their own languages, customs, and ancient tribal hatreds. This was not an army. It was a potential civil war waiting to happen. It was here that Spartacus's true genius, not just as a tactician, but as a leader of men, began to shine. With the weapons and armor captured from Glaber's annihilated force, he began to equip his best warriors, his original gladiators, as a corps of heavy infantry. But there was not enough to go around. So, he turned his camp on Vesuvius into a massive, makeshift weapons factory. He set the men to work. They harvested the wood of the forest, fire hardening the points of crude spears. They took their farming implements, scythes, sickles, and pitchforks, and reforged them into the crude, brutal tools of war. They wove shields from wicker and covered them with the untanned hides of captured cattle. It was a primitive, peasant army, but it was an army. More importantly, he began to instill in them a sense of discipline and a shared purpose. He, along with his inner circle of gladiators like the Gaul Crixus and the German Oinomaes, became the drill sergeants of this new army of the free. They began to teach them the basics of military formation, of how to stand together in a line, how to use their shields, how to fight not as a mob, but as a unit. And he gave them something that Rome had taken from them, a sense of their own worth. He enforced a strict rule of equitable distribution. All plunder, all food, was to be shared equally among all the men. There were no special privileges. They were a brotherhood, forged in the fires of their shared oppression and their shared dream of freedom. The Senate in Rome, stunned and infuriated by the humiliating defeat of Glaber, still failed to grasp the true nature of the threat. This was still seen not as a war, a bellum, but as a latrocinium, a large-scale outbreak of banditry. It was a police matter, a degrading affair not worthy of a true consular army. So they did not send a consul. They sent another praetor, Publius Varinius, this time with a larger, more substantial force of 2 new legions, a force of perhaps 10,000 men. Varinius was a more cautious commander than his predecessor. He understood that Spartacus was a clever tactician. He split his own forces into 3 parts to try and encircle and trap the growing slave army. It was a disastrous mistake. Spartacus, his intelligence network of local peasants keeping him informed of every Roman move, refused to be trapped. He used his superior knowledge of the terrain and the greater mobility of his lightly equipped army to deal with Varinius's divided forces one by one. He first fell upon the army of Varinius's subordinate, Furius, annihilating his 2,000 men. Then, he turned on the second subordinate, Cassinius, catching him completely by surprise while he was bathing at a local spring. Cassinius was killed, his camp was stormed, and his army was shattered. Spartacus, in a gesture of supreme contempt, now wore the captured purple-bordered toga and carried the official lictors fasces, the symbols of Roman authority that had belonged to the dead commander. Finally, Spartacus turned on Varinius himself and the main Roman force. He did not engage him in a pitched battle. He humiliated him with tactical brilliance. In one instance, he pinned Varinius's army in a difficult position. Then, overnight, he had his men prop up the corpses of recently killed soldiers, dressed in armor and holding weapons, to look like sentries guarding the camp. While Varinius and his men stared at this gruesome, silent picket line, Spartacus and his entire army silently slipped away in the darkness, marching through an unguarded pass. By the time Varinius realized he had been staring at an army of the dead, Spartacus was gone. When he finally caught up with him, the result was another crushing defeat. Varinius's army was routed, his camp was captured, and he himself barely escaped with his life, suffering the ultimate humiliation of losing his own warhorse to the rebel leader. The string of impossible victories had a snowball effect. The army of Spartacus was now an unstoppable force, a legend in its own time. The few dozen gladiators who had escaped with kitchen knives were now a force of over 70,000 men. They were no longer a ragged band of fugitives armed with farming tools. They were a victorious army, equipped with the captured armor, swords, and standards of 4 defeated Roman armies. They had become, in the terrified eyes of the Roman elite, an unkillable monster, a divine scourge sent to punish the Republic for its sins. With his army now a true and formidable power, Spartacus spent the winter of 73 to 72 BC in the rich, southern coastal towns, training his massive force. He had become the de facto king of a mobile warrior nation. But this success brought with it a deep and ultimately fatal division. What was the ultimate goal? What was this war for? Spartacus, the pragmatist, seems to have had a clear, strategic objective. He wanted to march his army north, out of Italy, across the Alps, and back to the homelands of his men, to Thrace, to Gaul, to Germania. The goal was not to destroy Rome, it was to escape it. It was a war for freedom. But for many of his followers, particularly the fiery Gallic chieftain Crassus, this was not enough. They had tasted victory. They had humiliated their former masters. Their blood was up. They did not want to escape. They wanted revenge. They wanted to stay in Italy, to plunder its rich, undefended cities, and ultimately to march on Rome itself. It was a war of vengeance. This fundamental, ideological split would haunt the rebellion to its very end. For now, however, they were united by their astonishing success. They had survived a winter, forged an army, and defeated every force the Roman Senate had sent against them. But they all knew that the time for fighting praetors and their rookie legions was over. The Senate, now thoroughly panicked and humiliated, was finally about to recognize this uprising for what it was, a full-scale war. And for the year 72 BC, they would not be sending praetors, they would be sending the consuls. The true legions of Rome were coming, and they were coming for blood. The news of the defeats of Publius Varinius and his subordinates struck the city of Rome with the force of a physical blow, each report more unbelievable and more humiliating than the last. This was no longer a minor brushfire on the periphery of the Republic. It was a raging, out-of-control inferno, consuming the very heart of Italy. The spectre that haunted the Roman psyche was not merely one of military defeat, but of a world turned upside down, a grotesque inversion of the natural order. Slaves who were legally property, mere tools with voices, instrumentum vocale, were not just rebelling, they were annihilating Roman legions, killing Roman commanders, and capturing the sacred symbols of Roman authority. The raw, primal fear that this induced in the Roman slave-owning aristocracy cannot be overstated. This was not just a war, it was a social apocalypse, the walking, breathing embodiment of their worst nightmares. The Senate, shaken from its arrogant complacency, was now gripped by a full-blown panic. The laughter and dismissive jokes about a gladiator war died on their lips, replaced by grim-faced emergency sessions and a frantic search for a solution. The rebellion of Spartacus was now officially declared a bellum, a true war, the most serious threat to the Italian mainland, since Hannibal Barca himself had descended from the Alps over a century earlier. The comparison was not made lightly. Like Hannibal, Spartacus was a seemingly invincible commander operating with impunity in Rome's backyard. But unlike Hannibal, who was a foreign invader, Spartacus was a cancer from within, a terrifying symbol of the instability that lay just beneath the surface of their entire slave-based economy. If his rebellion succeeded, if the idea of a successful slave revolt was allowed to take root, the entire foundation of the Republic could crumble. For the year 72 BC, the Senate did what it should have done from the start. They tasked both of the newly elected consuls, the highest military and political officers in the Republic, with the sole, urgent mission of crushing Spartacus. The men chosen for this task were Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. They were not brilliant military minds, but they were competent, experienced politicians, and they were given what Rome always believed was the ultimate solution to any problem: overwhelming force. 4 new, veteran legions were raised, forming 2 full consular armies. The plan was simple and brutal. They would march south and trap the slave army in a great pincer movement. Lentulus would block Spartacus's path to the north, while Gellius would advance from the south, attacking him from the rear. The rebel army, caught between 2 Roman hammers, would be smashed into oblivion. By this point, the rebel army had swollen to a colossal size, perhaps as many as 120,000 men, women, and children. But with this size came the fatal, ideological fracture that had been brewing all winter. The split between Spartacus and his second-in-command, Crassus, finally reached its breaking point. Spartacus, the strategist, remained adamant that their only true hope for freedom lay in escaping Italy. He intended to lead the great host north, across the Alps, after which the vast, multicultural army could disperse. each man returning to his homeland as a free person. It was a logical, pragmatic, and achievable goal. Crassus, however, would have none of it. Fueled by a deep, savage hatred for the Romans and emboldened by their string of unbroken victories, he saw the march north as an act of cowardice. He and his followers, a substantial force of some 30,000 Gauls and Germans, wanted to continue the war in Italy. They wanted more plunder, more revenge. They wanted to march on Rome itself and burn the city of their former masters to the ground. It was a dream born of pure, intoxicating rage, a dream that was strategically suicidal but emotionally irresistible to men who had suffered so much. No amount of persuasion from Spartacus could change his mind. The great slave army, which had been so miraculously united, now split apart. Crassus and his 30,000 men broke away from the main host and marched south on their own path of destruction. It was a catastrophic strategic blunder, a violation of the cardinal rule of warfare: never divide your forces in the face of a superior enemy. The Roman consuls marching south could not believe their luck. Their difficult task of trapping the rebel army had just been made infinitely easier by the rebels themselves. The consul Gellius, advancing from the south, encountered Crassus's smaller, isolated army near Mount Garganus in Apulia. Crassus, a brave but reckless commander, met the legions in a pitched battle. The result was a predictable and horrific slaughter. His undisciplined Gallic warriors were no match for the fresh, veteran legions of a full consular army. Crassus himself fought with legendary bravery, cutting down numerous legionaries before he was finally overwhelmed and killed. 2/3 of his army, 20,000 men, were annihilated in the battle. The first great victory of the war belonged to Rome. Gellius, his confidence soaring, now turned north to complete the pincer movement and crush the main prize, Spartacus. Spartacus, upon hearing the news of the annihilation of Crassus and his men, must have felt a mixture of profound grief and grim vindication. He had lost a huge portion of his army, but he had also been freed of its most reckless and undisciplined element. He now had a smaller, but more cohesive and loyal, force under his sole command, and with it, he would demonstrate his true, terrifying genius. As the consul Lentulus advanced to block his path to the north in the Apennine Mountains, Spartacus met him head-on. In a brilliant display of tactical mastery, he outmaneuvered and crushed Lentulus's 2 legions, sending them fleeing in a panicked rout. He had just destroyed one consular army. Then, in an act of almost unbelievable audacity, he immediately turned his army around and force-marched south. He met the second consular army, under Gellius, who was marching north in triumph after his victory over Crassus. Spartacus fell upon Gellius's legions before they even knew what was happening, and he crushed them too. In the space of a few days, Spartacus had done the impossible. He had met both of the main armies of the Roman Republic in succession, and he had utterly defeated them both. The great Roman pincer movement had been not just broken but shattered. The road north was now wide open. But before he continued his march, Spartacus paused to perform a chilling and unprecedented act of remembrance and revenge. He rounded up 300 of his Roman prisoners, and in honor of his fallen comrade, Crassus, he staged a set of funeral games. But these were not the athletic contests of the Greeks. He staged a Roman spectacle. He forced his Roman captives to fight each other to the death, as gladiators, for the entertainment of their former slaves. This was a moment of profound and terrible significance. The roles were now completely and grotesquely reversed. The masters had become the sport, the slaves had become the spectators, roaring for blood from the stands. It was the ultimate act of psychological retribution, a statement that the rebels were not just defeating Rome, but were adopting and inverting its cruelest traditions. It was a sign that the war was entering a new, darker, and more personal phase. After the grim funeral games were concluded, Spartacus resumed his great march north. He led his victorious army, its morale now at an absolute zenith, all the way to the northern border of Italy, near the city of Mutina. There, he encountered the final Roman army in his path, a force commanded by the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, and once again he crushed it. The path was now clear. Before him lay the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, the gateway to freedom. He had done it. He had defeated 4 Roman armies, including both of the year's consuls. He had marched the length of Italy. He had brought his people to the very threshold of their salvation. All they had to do was cross. And then, in the most baffling and tragic decision of the entire war, Spartacus turned around. The reasons for this fateful pivot are debated to this day. Were his own men, their blood up and their confidence soaring after so many victories, now infected with the same march on Rome fever that had doomed Crassus? Did they refuse to leave the rich plunder of Italy behind for the uncertain future of their homelands? Or did Spartacus himself, in a moment of hubris, now believe that he could actually accomplish the impossible and bring the Republic itself to its knees? Whatever the reason, the army of former slaves, with the gates of freedom wide open before them, turned their backs on the Alps and marched south again, back into the heart of the peninsula, back towards the jaws of a Rome that was now not just panicked, but murderously enraged. They had won their freedom, and in that very moment, they threw it all away. The news of the double consular defeat, the annihilation of 2 Roman armies in swift, humiliating succession, was a thunderclap that shook the city of Rome to its very foundations. The panic that had followed the initial defeats of the praetors now returned, but this time it was 100 times worse. It was a cold, existential dread. Spartacus was no longer a distant problem in the south. He was an invincible monster, a bogeyman of legendary proportions who had now defeated every army the Republic had sent against him. He had marched to the very foot of the Alps, and now, incomprehensibly, he was marching south again. The road to Rome was open, and the city, stripped of its legions, was effectively defenseless. The collective trauma of Hannibal's invasion, the memory of a foreign enemy at the gates, was resurrected, but this was a terror of a different order. This was not a foreign king. This was their own property, their own tools, risen up in a tidal wave of vengeance to burn their masters' homes. The Senate was in a state of paralysis. The consular elections for the following year were a farce. No one of any standing wanted the command. To be elected consul was to be handed a poisoned chalice, the near certainty of a humiliating and career-ending, if not life-ending, defeat at the hands of an escaped gladiator. The Republic, for the first time in its history, seemed to have run out of both generals and courage. The state was rudderless, adrift in a sea of its own terror, and the greatest slave army in history was marching unopposed through the heart of Italy. It was in this vacuum of power and fear that a new figure stepped forward from the shadows. He was not a celebrated war hero, nor a charismatic populist. He was something far more modern and far more dangerous. He was a plutocrat, a man whose power was derived not from noble ancestry or battlefield glory, but from a fortune so vast it was almost impossible to comprehend. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was, without a doubt, the richest man in Rome. His wealth was the stuff of legend, a colossal fortune built not on land, but on speculation, on shrewd and often monstrously predatory business practices. He had made his first great killings during the bloody civil wars of the previous generation, buying up the confiscated properties of proscribed and executed citizens for a pittance. His most famous and infamous enterprise was his private fire brigade. In a city of flammable wooden tenements, when a building caught fire, Crassus's brigade of 500 slave architects and builders would rush to the scene. But they would not put out the fire. Instead, Crassus himself would arrive, and as the flames licked at the neighboring properties, he would offer to buy the burning building and all the threatened adjacent ones from their terrified owners for a ridiculously low price. If they agreed, his brigade would spring into action and save what was left. If they refused, he would simply let it all burn to the ground and buy the land later. Through such ruthless methods, he had become the single largest landlord in the city of Rome, a man who literally owned a significant portion of the capital. But for all his wealth, for all his villas and his silver mines and his legions of slaves, Crassus was gnawed by a deep and bitter insecurity. He lived in the shadow of his great rival, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. Pompey was everything Crassus was not, a dashing, universally adored military hero who had won a string of glorious victories in the East. While Crassus was counting his money, Pompey was earning triumphs, the ultimate currency of prestige in the Roman Republic. Crassus craved this glory, this dignitas, with a desperate, all-consuming hunger. He had military experience, having commanded an army with distinction in the earlier civil wars, but he had never been given the sole, supreme command in a major conflict. He had never had the chance to prove that he was Pompey's equal on the battlefield. And now he saw his chance. The Spartacus War was a crisis, a national humiliation, but to the cold, calculating mind of Crassus, it was also a spectacular opportunity. It was a problem that no one else wanted, a poisoned chalice that he, with his immense resources, could turn into a golden goblet of eternal fame. While other senators were hiding and praying, Crassus made his move. He went before the terrified Senate and made an extraordinary offer. He volunteered to take on the command against Spartacus, and he would do it not just with the authority of the state, but with the full, terrifying power of his own personal fortune. He would raise, train, and equip 6 new legions, in addition to the 4 shattered remnants of the consular armies, effectively creating a new, massive army of over 40,000 men, funded out of his own pocket. The Senate, desperate and with no other viable options, agreed. They granted Crassus the special command, the imperium, of a proconsul. The vulture, who had been circling the dying republic, now had what he had always craved, a war of his own, and he would prosecute this war with the same cold, brutal, and terrifying efficiency with which he ran his business empire. His first act as commander was not to attack Spartacus, but to attack the morale of his own broken, terrified soldiers. The remnants of the consular armies were a disgrace, men who had been routed by slaves. Crassus knew he could not build a victorious army on a foundation of fear. He needed to restore the iron discipline that was the bedrock of the Roman legion. He needed to make his men more afraid of him than they were of the enemy. And to do this, he resurrected an ancient, brutal, and horrifying form of military punishment that had not been used in centuries: decimation. From among the cohorts that had shown the most cowardice in the previous battles, he selected one group of 500 men. From this group, lots were drawn. Every 10th man was pulled from the ranks, and then, in front of the entire assembled army, these 50 men were clubbed and stoned to death by their own comrades, the very men with whom they had shared a tent just the night before. It was a horrific, bloody lottery of death, an act of such merciless, impersonal cruelty that it sent a shockwave of terror through the entire army. The message was clear and unambiguous. Under Crassus, failure was not an option. Cowardice would not be tolerated. The price for retreating before the enemy was a 1 in 10 chance of being brutally murdered by your own friends. He had cauterized the wound of fear with the hot iron of absolute terror. He then re-equipped the legions with new weapons and armor, paid for from his own purse, and began a relentless regime of training. In a matter of weeks, he had transformed the demoralized rabble he had inherited into a hard, disciplined, and utterly terrified fighting force. The new Roman army was a reflection of its commander, cold, efficient, and merciless. Spartacus, who had been rampaging through southern Italy, now found himself facing a new and far more dangerous kind of enemy. This was not a complacent praetor or an incompetent consul. This was a man with the wealth of a king, the ambition of a god, and the soul of a predator. The amateur hour was over. The true war, the war of annihilation, was about to begin. The vulture was stooping, and the final, bloody act of the Servile War was set to unfold. The war had a new and terrible complexion. The arrival of Marcus Crassus and his newly forged army of terror fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Spartacus, the man who had danced circles around the fumbling consular armies, now found himself being hunted by an enemy who was his equal in cunning, his superior in resources, and his master in the art of relentless, soul-crushing pressure. Crassus was a shadow that Spartacus could not shake, a predator who matched his every move, always probing, always testing, but refusing to commit to the kind of decisive, pitched battle where Spartacus's tactical genius had previously won the day. Crassus was playing a long game, a war of logistics and attrition, a slow, methodical strangulation. As Spartacus and his great host moved through the Italian countryside, they found that the world had turned against them. The string of victories that had once been a beacon of hope for the oppressed now became a curse. The early flood of runaway slaves joining his cause had slowed to a trickle. The fear of Crassus's new, merciless legions, and the dawning realization that this rebellion, however glorious, was likely doomed, kept the slave population cowed and compliant. Worse still, the Italian towns and cities now barred their gates to him. They would not offer him supplies or sanctuary. They had seen the fate of those who resisted the Republic, and they chose the devil they knew. Spartacus was now a king without a kingdom, the leader of a massive, wandering nation of over 100,000 souls with no home, no allies, and an ever-dwindling supply of food, marching through a hostile land with a remorseless hunter stalking their every step. This new, desperate reality seems to have forced a final, fateful strategic decision upon Spartacus. The dream of marching on Rome, if it had ever been seriously entertained, was now clearly a fantasy. The Alps, the gateway to freedom that he had so tragically turned his back on, were now an impossible distance away, with Crassus's legions blocking the path. He was trapped in the Italian peninsula. He needed a new escape route, a new plan, and he found it in a desperate, audacious gamble. He would march his entire army to the very southern tip of Italy, to the Strait of Messina, the narrowest point of the sea that separated Italy from the island of Sicily. Sicily was not just an island, it was a symbol. It was a vast, grain-rich province that was, in many ways, the Roman Republic's original sin. Its conquest had been the prize of the First Punic War, and it had been ruthlessly exploited by its Roman masters ever since. Its vast agricultural estates, the latifundia, were worked by immense gangs of brutally oppressed slaves. More importantly, Sicily had a deep and potent history of slave rebellion. Twice in the preceding century, the island had exploded in two massive servile wars, uprisings of such scale and ferocity that they had required full consular armies to suppress. The memory of these great revolts was still fresh. This was Spartacus's final, brilliant hope. He would transport his veteran army across the strait to Sicily. The arrival of the legendary gladiator king and his invincible army would, he believed, act as a firebrand thrown into a tinderbox. He would ignite a third, even greater Sicilian slave war. He would not just be the leader of a wandering army. He would be the king of a new, independent kingdom, a fortress island from which he could defy the power of Rome indefinitely. It was a brilliant, visionary plan, but it had one fatal flaw. It depended on the honor of pirates. To cross the Strait of Messina, Spartacus needed ships, and he needed them in vast numbers. His only option was to deal with the Cilician pirates. These were not the romantic buccaneers of fiction. They were a powerful and organized maritime nation of sea raiders who controlled the eastern Mediterranean with a fleet of over 1,000 ships. They were the sworn enemies of Rome, a constant, irritating thorn in the Republic's side. Spartacus, seeing a common enemy, believed he had found a natural ally. He entered into negotiations with them, striking a deal. For a vast sum of the gold and silver his army had plundered, the pirates agreed to assemble a great fleet and transport his entire army to Sicily. And so, the great rebel host began its final, tragic march. They trekked the entire length of Italy, a river of humanity flowing to the toe of the peninsula, to the wild, rugged coastal region of Rhegium. Crassus and his legions shadowed them the entire way, a persistent, ominous presence on their heels, but never engaging, simply herding them south, deeper and deeper, into the geographic cul-de-sac. Spartacus and his army arrived at the coast. The shores of Sicily were visible in the distance, a tantalizingly close promised land. He paid the pirates their fee, and he waited for the ships to arrive. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited. The ships never came. The pirates, masters of treacherous self-interest, had played him for a fool. Whether they were bribed by Crassus with an even larger sum of money, or whether they had simply decided that betraying the rebel leader was a more profitable and less risky venture than defying Rome, the result was the same. They took Spartacus's gold and sailed away. It was the ultimate betrayal, a moment of devastating, soul-crushing finality. Spartacus and his entire nation were now trapped. They were at the absolute end of the world, with the sea at their front and Crassus and his legions sealing the land route behind them. The dream of a Sicilian kingdom died on that lonely beach. It was at this moment of supreme vulnerability that Crassus, the patient vulture, finally decided to strike. But he would not use swords, he would use shovels. He had herded his prey into the perfect trap. Now, he would build a cage to lock them in permanently. He put his legions to work on a project of such monstrous scale and ambition that it rivaled Caesar's later work at Alesia. He ordered them to construct a wall. Not just a wall, but a colossal line of fortifications, a rampart and a ditch, that would stretch from the Tyrrhenian Sea on one side of the peninsula to the Ionian Sea on the other. It was a wall that would sever the toe of Italy from the rest of the country, a man-made barrier of earth and timber that stretched for over 35 miles across a landscape of rugged, difficult mountains. The ditch alone was a marvel of engineering, 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide. Behind it rose a high, continuous wooden palisade. For weeks, Crassus's legions, the men he had forged into an instrument of his will, toiled with a discipline that bordered on the superhuman. They moved a volume of earth that was almost incomprehensible, cutting a great, defensive scar across the entire breadth of Italy. Spartacus and his men, their morale shattered by the pirates' betrayal, launched a series of furious, desperate attacks on the construction crews. But they could not stop the work. The wall kept growing. When it was finished, the strategic situation was absolute. Spartacus and his 100,000 followers were now completely, utterly imprisoned. They were trapped on a small, resource-poor peninsula with a finite supply of food. The hunter, Crassus, had not even needed to fight. He had simply built a cage around his prey. And now, he settled in for the winter, content to sit behind his impossible wall and listen to the sounds of his enemy, the greatest slave army in history, slowly, inexorably, beginning to starve to death. The final act of the tragedy had begun, and its stage was a prison camp the size of a province. Winter descended upon the toe of Italy not just as a season, but as an ally of Rome. The cold winds that swept down from the snow-capped mountains brought with them the chilling specter of starvation. Inside the vast, 35-mile-long prison camp that Crassus had built, Spartacus and his people were dying. The land they were trapped in, the rugged and sparsely populated region of Rhegium, had been stripped bare. The food was gone. The once invincible army that had feasted on the spoils of a dozen victories was now a starving, shivering mob, their triumphs a distant, bitter memory. The mood in the rebel camp had devolved from the shock of betrayal into a deep, gnawing, and potentially explosive despair. Spartacus, the leader who had performed miracle after miracle, now faced his greatest challenge. Not just an external enemy, but the internal collapse of his own people's will to survive. He was a master of morale, a leader who understood that an army's true strength lies in its spirit. He had to give them hope, however desperate, however slim. He could not allow them to simply waste away, to die meekly in the cage Crassus had built for them. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. If they were to die, they would die as they had lived for the past 2 years, as free warriors, fighting. And so, in the depths of that desperate winter, he conceived of his most audacious, most brutal, and most sacrificial plan yet. He would not wait for starvation. He would break out. But how? The wall Crassus had built was not a simple fence. It was a monumental feat of military engineering, a 15-foot deep ditch fronting a high, continuous palisade, manned by 40,000 of Rome's most disciplined and merciless soldiers. A frontal assault by a starving and weakened army would be a suicidal act of mass butchery. Spartacus knew this. He needed a miracle, an act of such desperate ingenuity that it would once again catch the methodical, conventional Roman mind completely by surprise. And he found his inspiration in the very elements that were tormenting his people. The winter snow and the darkness of the night. He waited for the perfect moment. He waited for a night of ferocious winter weather, a night when a blizzard swept across the mountains, burying the landscape in a deep blanket of snow. The howling wind and the blinding snow would provide the perfect cover, a natural cloak of invisibility for his desperate gambit. On this chosen night, under the cover of the storm, Spartacus put his plan into motion. It was a plan of horrifying, but necessary, sacrifice. He first ordered a contingent of his men to kill their own pack animals, their horses and their cattle. They then took the bodies of the slaughtered animals, along with the bodies of any prisoners or soldiers who had recently died, and began to fill a single, pre-selected section of the massive Roman ditch. It was a gruesome, terrible task. In the freezing darkness, his men worked in silence, creating a makeshift bridge, a causeway of frozen corpses and earth. At the same time, other groups were tasked with gathering immense quantities of wood and brush, creating fascines, large, tightly bound bundles of sticks and branches. Then came the assault. It was not a grand, army-wide charge. It was a concentrated, rapier thrust, aimed at one single point in Crassus's 35-mile line. Under the cover of the blizzard's roar, Spartacus and a hand-picked force of his best warriors stormed towards the corpse-filled ditch. They threw their fascines on top of the makeshift bridge, creating a solid surface to cross. They swarmed across the ditch and began a ferocious, surprise assault on the Roman palisade. The Roman sentries, half frozen and blinded by the snow, were caught completely by surprise. The alarm was raised, but the storm muffled the sounds, and the Roman response was slow and disorganized. A savage, desperate battle erupted in the darkness on that one section of the wall. It was a fight of pure, animalistic fury. Spartacus and his gladiators, their bodies gaunt from hunger, but their spirits ignited by a final, desperate hope, fought with the strength of madmen. They clawed their way over the wall, their breakout attempt turning into a bloody, close-quarters melee in the heart of the Roman fortifications. But Crassus was not a complacent praetor. His camp was a model of Roman discipline, and his response, though delayed, was swift and brutal. He rushed reinforcements to the threatened sector, and the battle on the wall became a horrific, swirling vortex of death. The losses for the rebels were staggering. They were throwing themselves against the Roman meat grinder, paying for every foot of ground with a mountain of their own dead. But they were not trying to win a battle, they were trying to punch a hole. And they succeeded. In a final, desperate push, Spartacus and his vanguard managed to break through the Roman line. But it was a victory that was almost indistinguishable from a catastrophic defeat. Of the perhaps 60,000 warriors who had launched the assault, it is estimated that only a third of them, around 20,000, managed to make it through the breach and escape into the countryside beyond. The other 40,000 were left behind, either dead in the snow around the fortifications, or trapped on the wrong side of the wall, their escape route cut off. Spartacus had sacrificed 2/3 of his remaining army to save 1/3. It was a brutal, horrifying, but ultimately successful act of strategic surgery. He had amputated the limb to save the body. The morning after the breakout, the scale of the carnage was revealed. The snow around the breached section of the wall was stained crimson for hundreds of yards, a testament to the night's horrific slaughter. Crassus had been outsmarted, his perfect cage broken, but he had also inflicted devastating, irreplaceable losses on the rebel army. He had won a tactical defeat, but in doing so, had perhaps achieved a greater strategic victory. Spartacus was now free, but he was a different kind of free. He was no longer the commander of a vast, world-shaking host. He was the leader of a small, battle-hardened, but now utterly isolated army of survivors. The women, children, and followers who had been with them were now mostly gone, left behind in the trap. This was a purely military force, and it was a force without a future. They were no longer a nation on the march. They were a cornered wolf pack, and their only remaining purpose was to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The escape, as heroic as it was, had also sown the final, fatal seeds of division within the rebel ranks. The surviving army, now hardened and radicalized by the horrors they had endured, once again fractured. Two of Spartacus's subordinate Gallic commanders, Gannicus and Castus, heady with the victory of the escape, once again defied Spartacus's cautious leadership. They broke away with their own large contingent of about 12,000 men, determined to once again seek plunder and a direct confrontation with the Romans. Crassus, his fury at being outsmarted now a cold, methodical desire for annihilation, saw his chance. He fell upon this isolated Gallic force with the full weight of his legions. The battle was a one-sided massacre. Gannicus and Castus were killed, and their entire 12,000-man army was wiped off the face of the earth. Crassus, in a chilling act of psychological warfare, did not bury the dead. He left their bodies to rot, a grim warning to the last remaining rebel army. Spartacus, his army now whittled down to its final, unbreakable core, was alone. The tragic cycle of division and defeat had repeated itself. He had escaped the trap at the end of the world, but in doing so, he had only found himself in a smaller, more desperate cage. There was no escape to Sicily. There was no retreat to the Alps. There was only one direction left to march, north, towards Rome. Not in a march of conquest, but in a final, glorious, and suicidal death ride. The end was near. The breaking of Crassus's wall was a Pyrrhic victory written in blood and snow, a tactical miracle that only served to illuminate the strategic bankruptcy of the rebellion. Spartacus was free, but his freedom was a curse. He was now the leader of a ghost army, a hardened core of perhaps 30,000 survivors, haunted by the tens of thousands of comrades they had left behind, dead or trapped in the south. The dream of escape, the hope of a new kingdom, all of it was gone, consumed by the harsh realities of a war they could not win. The rebellion, which had begun as a desperate lunge for freedom, then transformed into a glorious war of conquest, had now entered its final, tragic phase. It had become a death march. Spartacus, his heart heavy with the loss of Gannicus and Castus and their 12,000 men, turned his army north. It was a final, desperate surge, a convulsive, reflexive strike back towards the heart of the enemy. It was not a march of conquest. It was a flight, a chaotic and furious attempt to find some new, unknown escape route, perhaps to the port of Brundisium, or simply to wreak as much havoc as possible before the inevitable end. This final, desperate rampage spread a new wave of terror through Italy. The rebel army, no longer burdened by families or a long-term vision, was now a pure instrument of war, a wounded, cornered beast lashing out at its tormentors with the fury of the dying. In Rome, the news of Spartacus's escape and the destruction of the force under Gannicus and Castus was met with a mixture of relief and profound impatience. Crassus had inflicted massive casualties, but he had failed in his primary objective. He had let Spartacus escape. The Senate, smelling blood in the water and eager to put an end to this humiliating war once and for all, began to waver in their support for Crassus. The political vultures were circling. Crassus's great rival, Pompey the Great, the hero of the Spanish campaigns, was now returning to Italy with his victorious legions. Another celebrated general, Lucullus, was returning from his own victories in the east. The Senate, in a move calculated to both end the war and to rob Crassus of the sole glory, now recalled both of these celebrity generals and their armies to Italy to assist in the final destruction of the rebel army. For Crassus, this was a waking nightmare. He had poured his fortune, his reputation, and his terrifying will into this war. The glory of crushing Spartacus was meant to be his alone, the victory that would finally make him Pompey's equal. Now, he was about to have his prize stolen from him at the last possible second. The news lit a fire under him. He could no longer afford a patient, methodical war. He had to force a final, decisive battle and annihilate Spartacus before Pompey and Lucullus could arrive and claim a share of the credit. The hunt, which had been a cold, calculated pursuit, now became a frantic, desperate race. Spartacus, his own intelligence likely informing him of the new Roman armies converging on him, also knew that the end was near. He was now facing the prospect of being trapped not by one, but by 3 separate Roman armies. He had to fight, and he had to fight now. He chose his ground for his final stand in southern Italy, near the headwaters of the Sila River in Lucania. There, in the spring of 71 BC, the last army of the oppressed turned to face the full, concentrated fury of the Roman Republic. The moments before the final battle are steeped in legend, tales that capture the fatalistic grandeur of the rebellion's last breath. The historian Florus tells us that when his men brought Spartacus his warhorse, he drew his sword and killed it. "If I am victorious," he declared to his astonished men, "I shall have horses enough. If I am defeated, I shall have no need of this one." It was a clear, unambiguous message. There would be no retreat. There would be no escape. This was a battle to the death. Victory, or Valhalla. He then assembled his army for the final time. They were no longer 100,000 strong. They were a fraction of that, a small, gaunt, but battle-hardened force of veterans who had survived 2 years of hell. They were the originals, the unbreakable core, and Spartacus, the man who had led them out of the kitchens of Capua, now prepared to lead them into eternity. The battle itself was not a masterpiece of tactical cunning like Vesuvius or the consular defeats. There were no tricks, no ambushes. It was an apocalypse. It was a raw, primordial clash of 2 massive armies, a head-on collision of hatred and desperation. Crassus's legions, disciplined, terrified of their own commander, and desperate to end this long war, advanced in their perfect, silent lines. The rebel army, knowing they were fighting for their very last sunrise, met them with a single, unified, suicidal roar. The 2 shield walls smashed into each other with a sound like the cracking of the world. What followed was a swirling, chaotic vortex of slaughter, a battle of such ferocious intensity that it surpassed everything that had come before. The rebels, fighting with the superhuman strength of men with nothing left to lose, began to gain the upper hand in certain sectors. Their fury and desperation were a match for even Roman discipline. But the central, defining drama of the entire battle was Spartacus himself. He was not a general commanding from a safe position in the rear. He was a warrior, a gladiator, and he had a single personal objective. He did not want to just win the battle. He wanted to kill the man who had tormented him, the man who represented everything he hated about Rome. He wanted to kill Crassus. With a small, elite bodyguard of his strongest warriors, Spartacus ignored the wider battle. He became a human spearhead, a wedge of pure fury, and he launched a direct, suicidal charge through the heart of the Roman legions, trying to cut his way to the spot where he could see Crassus on his horse, directing the battle. What he did next is one of the most legendary feats of individual bravery in all of ancient history. He was a one-man army, a demigod of destruction. He cut his way through the ranks of terrified legionaries. He was wounded in the thigh by a spear, the iron head lodging deep in his flesh, and he fell to one knee, but he did not stop. He used his shield to prop himself up and continued to fight from his knees, his sword a blur of motion, his voice roaring defiance. He personally killed 2 of the centurions acting as Crassus's bodyguards, getting tantalizingly close to his final prize. But it was an impossible task. He was just one man against a sea of iron. The Roman legionaries, seeing his incredible bravery and recognizing him as the heart of the rebellion, swarmed him. He was stabbed from all sides, pierced by a dozen spears and swords at once. He disappeared under a mountain of Roman soldiers. Spartacus, the Thracian slave, the gladiator, the king of the rebellion, was dead. He died as he had lived, fighting. His death was the death of the rebellion. As the news spread through the rebel ranks that their charismatic, seemingly immortal leader had fallen, their courage finally broke. The fight went out of them. The shield wall, which had held so firm, now wavered, then shattered. The battle turned into a rout, and the rout turned into a massacre. Crassus's legions, their blood up, showed no mercy. They surrounded the fleeing slaves and cut them down by the thousands. The slaughter was total. The Sila River, like the Aufidus at Cannae, ran red with the blood of the defeated. Crassus had won his victory. It was a victory of annihilation. But his triumph was not yet complete. The body of Spartacus, the prize he would have loved to display, was never definitively found. It had been so hacked and dismembered in the final, chaotic melee that it was unrecognizable, lost forever among the heaps of the slain. But Crassus still had thousands of prisoners, and for them he had reserved a special, terrible fate. Pompey and Lucullus were on their way. Crassus needed to make a statement, a monument to his victory so vast, so terrifying, and so unforgettable that no other general could ever steal his glory. He had won the battle. Now, he would begin the work of terror. The battle was over, but the war against the memory of Spartacus had just begun. Crassus had won his total, annihilating victory. The rebel army had been shattered, its legendary leader lost and unidentifiable in a sea of carnage. But victory on the battlefield was not enough for Marcus Licinius Crassus. His ambition was a bottomless pit, his insecurity a gnawing beast. He was terrified that his rival, Pompey the Great, who was now marching down from the north, would somehow manage to steal the glory of his hard-won victory. In fact, Pompey did manage to do just that, on a small scale. He intercepted a scattered band of 5,000 rebel survivors who had escaped the final battle and cut them to pieces, immediately sending a dispatch to the Senate declaring that while Crassus had merely defeated the slaves in a battle, he, Pompey, had extirpated the rebellion by the roots. The message was a political dagger aimed at Crassus's heart, and it drove him to an act of retaliatory spectacle that would forever cement his name in the annals of terror. He could not display the body of Spartacus in a triumph, the ultimate prize, so he would create a different kind of trophy, a trophy made of living, screaming men. He still held 6,000 prisoners, the last, unlucky remnant of the great slave army. For these 6,000 souls, there would be no swift execution, no quiet death in a prison. Crassus decided he would make them into a message. He would transform the very landscape of Italy into a monument to his victory, and a warning of such horrifying magnitude that the very thought of another slave revolt would be rendered impossible for 1,000 years. He chose as his canvas the most famous and sacred of all Roman roads, the Via Appia, the Appian Way. This was the great artery of the Republic, the Queen of Roads, stretching from the gates of Rome itself south to the city of Capua, the very city where the rebellion had been born. It was the most heavily trafficked road in Italy, a constant procession of merchants, soldiers, senators, and common folk. This would be his stage. His orders were simple, direct, and monstrous in their logistical scope. He commanded his legions, now acting as a grim and efficient construction crew, to erect 6,000 wooden crosses along the entire 120-mile stretch of the Appian Way. The spacing was to be precise, roughly 150 feet between each cross, ensuring that a traveler on the road would never be out of sight of at least one of the crucified. The process of the crucifixion itself was a Roman specialty, an art form of slow, agonizing, and public death that they had perfected over centuries. It was not just an execution, it was a form of political and social theater, the ultimate penalty reserved for the lowest of the low, pirates, traitors, and above all, rebellious slaves. The first step was the scourging. Each of the 6,000 prisoners was stripped naked and brutally flogged with the flagrum, a horrific whip made of multiple leather thongs embedded with pieces of bone and metal, designed to rip the flesh from a man's back. Then came the procession of death. Each man, his back a bloody ruin, was forced to carry his own patibulum, the heavy horizontal crossbeam, to the site of his execution. They were marched out in chains, a long, stumbling, moaning column of the damned, and delivered to their designated spots along the great road. There, the legions, working with the same methodical discipline with which they had built their siege walls, began the final, terrible work. The prisoner was thrown to the ground. His arms were stretched out along the crossbeam. A soldier would then take a long, thick iron spike and with a heavy mallet, drive it through the man's wrist, between the bones of the forearm, pinning his hand to the wood. The sound, the wet crunch of bone and sinew, the percussive clang of iron on iron, and the raw, animal scream of a man experiencing an agony beyond human comprehension, was repeated 6,000 times. The crossbeam was then hoisted up by ropes and fixed into a permanent vertical stake that had already been set in the ground. The man's feet were then nailed, either together or separately, to the vertical post. And then he was simply left there, to die. And the dying was a slow, meticulous, and excruciating process that could take days. It was a masterpiece of engineered agony. The cause of death was not blood loss. It was, in the end, a slow suffocation. Hanging by his arms, the victim's own body weight would pull down on his chest, making it progressively harder and harder to breathe. To get a single desperate gasp of air, he would have to push himself up on the nail driven through his feet, an act that sent searing, white-hot waves of pain up his entire body. It was a horrifying, cyclical torture, the agony of suffocation, followed by the agony of the nails back and forth, for hours that stretched into days. And all of this was done in public. For weeks, the Appian Way became a corridor of hell, an avenue of death. Travelers were forced to pass through this gallery of suffering, assailed on all sides by the sights, sounds, and smells of mass death. They saw the 6,000 bodies, writhing in their final agonies. They heard the cacophony of their screams, their pleas for mercy, their curses against their executioners, a sound that eventually faded into a constant, low moan of despair. They were tormented by thirst, their bodies exposed to the burning sun by day and the freezing cold by night. They were attacked by insects and carrion birds, who would often begin their gruesome work while the victims were still alive. This was Crassus's triumph. It was not a parade through the streets of Rome. It was a sprawling, static, and infinitely more terrifying monument to his power and his ruthlessness. It was a message written in the language of pain, and its grammar was absolute. This, it said to every slave in the Republic, is what happens when you dare to dream. This is the price of freedom. This is the power of Rome. Every dying man on every cross was a nail driven into the coffin of the idea of rebellion itself. The sheer, industrial scale of the act is what sets it apart. It was not a hot-blooded massacre in the aftermath of a battle. It was a cold, calculated, and logistically complex act of state-sponsored terror. It required thousands of trees to be felled, thousands of crosses to be built, thousands of nails to be forged, and the disciplined, organized labor of an entire army to carry it out. It was Roman efficiency applied to the science of human suffering. Crassus never got the full glory he craved. The Senate, in a final political slap in the face, awarded the more prestigious triumph for the war to Pompey for his minor role in mopping up the fugitives, while Crassus was granted only a lesser honor, an ovation. But in the end, Crassus had the last word. His monument was not a one-day parade. His monument was the Appian Way. For months, the 6,000 bodies were left to rot on their crosses, their skeletons picked clean, a permanent and silent reminder of the war that had almost broken the Republic, and the man who had been willing to descend into the depths of inhumanity to win it. The road to Capua, where the rebellion had been born in a desperate lunge for freedom, was now the very road that displayed, in 6,000 terrible chapters, the final, brutal price of that dream. The 6,000 crosses on the Appian Way eventually rotted and fell. The bones of the last rebel army were scattered by the wind and the wolves, their individual stories erased, their names forgotten. Marcus Crassus, the architect of this terror, had achieved his goal. The memory of the Servile War was so successfully cauterized by this act of mass horror that a slave rebellion on this scale would never again threaten the Roman Republic. The warning had been understood, the chains were tightened, the spirit of resistance was seemingly crushed forever, and the vast, brutal, and immensely profitable engine of Roman slavery ground on for another 500 years. Crassus himself would go on to form the famous First Triumvirate with his rivals, Pompey and Julius Caesar, his victory over Spartacus finally giving him the military prestige he had so desperately craved. He had, in the cold calculus of Roman politics, won. And what of Spartacus? In the immediate aftermath of his defeat, his name became a curse word in Rome, a synonym for chaos, for social collapse, for the terrifying threat of the world turned upside down. Roman historians, writing from the perspective of the victorious aristocracy, treated him as little more than a brilliant, but ultimately destructive, bandit. They acknowledged his courage, they marveled at his tactical genius, but they framed his rebellion not as a noble fight for freedom, but as a calamitous outbreak of theft and murder, a madness that had to be put down with extreme prejudice for the good of civilization. For the Roman world, the final image of Spartacus was not the hero on the battlefield, but the thousands of rotting corpses his rebellion had left on the crosses, a testament to the folly and the horrific price of defying the natural order of things. His body was never found, denying him a tomb, a relic, a single place where his memory could be anchored. Rome's victory was so absolute that it seemed to have erased him from the physical world entirely. But you cannot crucify an idea. While the body of the man was lost, the legend of Spartacus had only just begun its long, extraordinary journey. A curious thing happened as the centuries passed. The name that was once a curse began to transform. In the dying days of the Roman Empire, as its own internal rot mirrored the social chaos Spartacus had unleashed, some Roman writers began to look back on him with a kind of grudging admiration. He was seen as a noble enemy, a man of incredible ability who, had he been born a Roman, might have been one of their greatest generals. It was with the collapse of the old aristocratic world and the rise of new ideas in the 18th century Enlightenment that the true resurrection of Spartacus began. Thinkers like Voltaire, searching for historical precedents for their revolutionary ideals, rediscovered the story of the Thracian gladiator. They saw in him not a bandit, but a hero. He was a man who had fought for the natural rights of man against a tyrannical and corrupt system. He became a classical hero for a new age, a symbol of the universal human desire to be free. The slave who had terrified the Roman aristocracy was now being celebrated in the salons of Paris. This transformation reached its zenith in the 20th century, when Spartacus was adopted as a potent symbol by the very people who saw themselves as the inheritors of the struggle against oppression, the communists. For Karl Marx, the slave revolt was a clear example of the historical class struggle. Spartacus became a proto-communist icon, a revolutionary martyr. In post-World War I Germany, the radical socialist faction that attempted to seize power called themselves the Spartacus League. In Soviet Russia, Spartacus was a celebrated hero of the proletariat, his name given to sports clubs, public squares, and even a famous ballet. The man who had likely just wanted to lead his people home had been posthumously transformed into a global icon of revolutionary socialism. And then came Hollywood. The 1960 epic film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas and directed by Stanley Kubrick, cemented the modern image of Spartacus in the global consciousness. The film, written by the blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, was itself an act of rebellion against the political oppression of the McCarthy era. Its most famous and powerful scene, the "I'm Spartacus" moment, where each captured slave stands to claim the identity of their leader to protect him, is a pure invention found in no historical source. But it is a scene of such profound emotional power that it has come to define the entire legend. It perfectly encapsulates the idea of solidarity, of a collective identity forged in the struggle against tyranny. And so, the paradox of Spartacus is complete. In life, he was a failure. He did not free the slaves. His rebellion was utterly and horrifically crushed. His army was annihilated. His name was erased. His body was lost. By every practical measure, he lost. But in death, he achieved an immortality that his conqueror, Crassus, could only dream of. Crassus is remembered by history, if he is remembered at all, as a grasping, cruel, and obscenely wealthy man who met his own gruesome end in a disastrous war in the East, where legend says the Parthians, mocking his thirst for wealth, executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. Spartacus, on the other hand, the man who owned nothing but his own courage, became a symbol that has transcended time. His story speaks to one of the most fundamental and powerful of all human desires, the will to be free. He is the eternal underdog, the slave who dared to stand up to an empire, the man who proved that the human spirit, even when caged, brutalized, and condemned to death, cannot be entirely extinguished. The 6,000 crosses on the Appian Way were a monument to the power of Rome. But the immortal legend of Spartacus, a story that continues to inspire rebels, revolutionaries, and dreamers to this day, is a testament to a power that is even greater, the enduring, unkillable idea of freedom.